Hey there, and welcome to this deep dive. You've clearly got a strategic mind to be diving into Clausewitz with us. Today, we're zeroing in on his ideas about force concentration and the strategic reserve, particularly from chapters 11 and 12 of On War.
And even though he was writing back in the 19th century, what's remarkable is how much of what Clausewitz talked about is still studied in military academies today.
It's like that old saying, the more things change.
The more they stay the same.
Exactly.
Ah,
Especially when it comes to the fundamental principles of warfare.
absolutely. So for you listening, we're going to break down these concepts in a way that's both insightful and hopefully applicable to the way you think about strategy, even in today's world.
Clausewitz really emphasized the importance of assembling your forces in both space and time. He argued against unnecessarily dividing your forces unless absolutely necessary.
So no scattering your forces to cover more ground unless you absolutely have to. Right. He was all about concentrating your power. He even uses the analogy of focusing sunlight through a magnifying glass. You get a much more intense beam when it's concentrated than when it's spread out.
That makes a lot of sense. You're putting all your energy into one spot.
Mm.
And Clausewitz argues that the same principle applies to military force. It's about finding that decisive point, that critical point of vulnerability in the enemy's lines, and striking with everything you've got.
And that's where the idea of the decisive point comes in, which is key to understanding Clausewitz's thinking. He says in On War, and I quote, "The best strategy is always to be very strong, first generally, then at the decisive point."
So it's not enough to just have a strong force overall. You need to know where and how to concentrate that force for maximum impact. It's about choosing your battles, picking the time and place where you can deliver a knockout punch.
Precisely. And Clausewitz was wary of what he called the mysterious feeling of conventional manner. Essentially, he's cautioning against blindly following tradition or splitting forces just because that's how it's always been done.
It's like falling into a routine, even if that routine isn't the most strategically sound option.
Exactly. It's about adapting to the circumstances, analyzing the situation, and then striking at the decisive point with concentrated force.
So we've talked about concentrating force in terms of where, but Clausewitz also talks about the importance of when you bring your forces to bear. And he illustrates this with a really fascinating tactical example in chapter 12, where he presents a scenario with two opposing forces. One have 1,000 soldiers, the other has only 500.
On the surface, you'd think the larger force has an automatic advantage. But Clausewitz throws a bit of a curveball here.
Yeah, because he argues that if the smaller force strategically holds back a reserve, they can actually gain a tactical edge. And this is where I thought things got really interesting. How does that even work?
Think about it this way. The larger force might have more firepower initially, but they're also going to take more casualties and expend their resources faster. Clausewitz is saying the smaller force, by holding back a reserve, can exploit that moment of weakness.
It's like they're pacing themselves, waiting for the right moment to unleash that fresh force.
Exactly. They're letting the larger force wear themselves out, and then they're striking when the enemy is most vulnerable, potentially changing the course of the battle.
So it's not just about brute strength in numbers.
Mhm.
It's about strategy and timing. And this idea of a reserve, that's not just for small-scale skirmishes, is it? Clausewitz argues that it's essential even on a much larger strategic level.
Absolutely. In fact, he's even more adamant about it when it comes to entire campaigns.
Yeah.
Having a strategic reserve, whether it's additional troops, resources, or even just options, provides that critical flexibility in warfare. Imagine a general who commits all their forces to one front only to have a surprise offensive erupt somewhere else. Without a reserve, they're caught completely off guard, and their ability to respond effectively is severely limited.
That's a recipe for disaster, especially given how unpredictable warfare can be. It makes you wonder, though, how these principles hold up in the face of modern warfare. Things like cyber warfare, drones, the kind of technology and global interconnectedness that Clausewitz couldn't have even imagined back then.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But that's also the mark of how insightful Clausewitz was, because even though he couldn't have foreseen the specifics of 21st century warfare, his work still resonates today.
So even though the battlefields look vastly different now, the fundamental principles of strategy still apply.
In many ways, yes. Let's take the idea of force concentration. In the 19th century, that might have meant physically amassing battalions at a choke point. Today, it could look like concentrating your cyber attacks on an enemy's critical infrastructure, or focusing air power on key enemy command centers. It's the same principle at play, just applied in a different context.
Instead of troops and cannons, we're talking data streams and drones. But the core concept remains relevant. What about the decisive point? Has that idea evolved as well?
Absolutely. If anything, it might be even more important in today's interconnected world. Think about it. Disrupting an enemy's communication network or crippling their logistics chain can have a domino effect, even more so than capturing a physical location.
So you're saying in modern warfare, the decisive point might not be a place on a map at all. It can be something less tangible, like access to information or control of the narrative. You're
Right.
right. And that makes me think about Clausewitz's emphasis on the strategic reserve. How does that translate to the complexities of modern warfare, where the lines between conventional and unconventional warfare are increasingly blurred?
That's where Clausewitz's focus on adaptability really shines through. Because in today's world, a nation's strategic reserve might not be just about having extra troops or tanks on standby. It might also include things like diplomatic leverage, economic sanctions, even the ability to shape public opinion through media and information.
So it's about having a diverse toolkit, not just hard power, but also soft power. You need options and the ability to respond to a wide range of threats, some of which might not even be military in nature.
Exactly. And that's why studying Clausewitz is still so relevant today, even if you're not on the front lines. He provides a framework for strategic thinking that can be applied to so many different fields and challenges.
It's not about memorizing formulas. It's about understanding the underlying principles and then adapting them to your specific situation, whether you're facing a military opponent, a business competitor, or even just trying to solve a complex problem.
I think that's a great takeaway from our deep dive today. Clausewitz gives us these incredibly powerful tools, but he also reminds us that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The key is to think critically challenge assumptions and be prepared to adapt.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Clausewitz's ideas about force concentration and the strategic reserve, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to remember, especially those serving in the military today?
I'd say embrace adaptability and critical thinking. Remember, Clausewitz gives us invaluable tools, but emphasizes that warfare is constantly evolving. We must adapt, innovate, and constantly challenge our assumptions in this ever-changing landscape.
Don't just memorize the principles, internalize them. Understand the why behind the what, and then have the courage to apply them to the specific challenges you face.
That's where the true value of Clausewitz lies. He makes you think differently and see things from a new perspective. That's what can make a real difference on the battlefield and beyond.
Well said. And for all our listeners out there, as you continue your own deep dive into Clausewitz's work, we leave you with this final thought. What would Clausewitz say about 21st century warfare? How would he apply his timeless principles to the complexities of cyber warfare, drone technology, and the rise of non-state actors? We encourage you to explore these questions. You might be surprised by the insights you uncover. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, questioning, and most importantly, keep learning.